Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 48 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. We've got the three of us back together, back here with Curt and Jerry. And we are going to return to a topic we spoke about quite a bit in the earlier episodes, term serve and return. And this is one that's thinking back on our topics that we've done as we sort of approach this year. We were sort of throwing this out in the early episodes. I think it was about like 6, 7, and 8. We were doing some stuff around this. But I think there's a lot more that we can learn here. And I had some outstanding questions as well about this concept. So we're going to explore this communication topic today, see how it goes. And as always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. So, Curt, I know you were coming down from the mountains today. So what's your bright, shiny object this week?
Well, I guess I have to say it was being in the mountains.
Yes.
It was so great to be out in nature. And I was stricken by how much easier it was to disconnect from work-related thoughts when I was physically distant. So combining those two things was really nice. Being both physically distant and mentally distant and letting myself recharge a little bit was really wonderful.
Very cool. Very cool. Jerry, what about you? What are you thinking about this week?
I was presenting up in Dillon on Friday, and I was reminded of how lucky we are to have firefighters.
Yeah.
Smoke was very visible, and we have fires here all over the state of Colorado, and in California.
Yeah.
And many of those firefighters are volunteers that go out and put their lives on the line and protect others, and so I thought today we take a moment and just kind of recognize them. And also, there's lots of injuries and lots of impacts emotionally to working in those type of situations. So I thought it was appropriate to take some time and just say thank you for what they do.
Absolutely. And even, as someone who lived up in the mountains for several years, if you've never had to be evacuated from your home, it's a different experience. The fact that you can't physically get to your house. And luckily for Sarah and I, it was short. If the fire's threatening you, they'll evacuate you. We were lucky enough never to be really at risk, but close enough to be evacuated a few times. And it's a disoriented experience. And so obviously to the first responders and, some of those like guys and gals jump out of airplanes to do this work. I mean, you talk about people with some courage. Jumping out of an airplane into a fire, like that takes I don't know, neurobiologically, I don't think I'm created quite to do that. Oh, there's a fire. I'm going to jump out of an airplane to go fight that. Pretty remarkable stuff. And I've been talking to a few people in California for some trainings out there, and it just seems like, devastation out there as well. So all the best. And that kind of flows into mine too. I was telling Curt before the podcast about everything I've had on my schedule for this week has not been pulled off. I was supposed to do a training in Fountain, Colorado, which is just south of Colorado Springs. And I get this call. I've never had a training canceled before, and I get this call from my contact down there. And I've been working with that district for about 3 years. And he's panicked, and I'm like, oh, hey, what's going on? Because I'm already down in the Springs. I was going to have dinner with a friend down there. And he's like, let me paint the picture for you. All of our teachers, and I was going to do a new teacher orientation, we're at the professional development building, and a just devastating hailstorm moved through. And he says there's not a windshield left intact in the entire parking lot. So if you can think about like all these poor teachers, and Jerry and I can tell you, there's nothing to see stress as a teacher preparing for the first day of school. And to just imagine hundreds of these cars with it broke my heart. So I was supposed to have lunch today, but they shut down I-70 due to the fire. So it's just been technology. I'm waiting for like a swarm of locusts to come and just finish me off during the podcast. But
so this is your bright, shiny object?
Yeah, this is my bright, shiny object.
Oh my God, this is going to be some podcast.
I know. Though I do have something positive. I got some more swag. As I tell our listeners, send me a T-shirt. I'll wear it on air. So this was from an interfaith conference that I went to, and my good friend Brian Arnold. So it's Aurora Warm the Night, great T-shirt, double XL again, if anybody wants to get their swag on the air. So thanks, Brian. It was a great honor to speak at that conference. So there's my real bright, shiny object of the week. I got some more swag. So
Good. Now I feel better, man.
Good.
At least serve and return.
We're done with
Yes,
talking
thank
morbid
you.
objects. Now we can go on to something.
We could go on. So one of the reasons I wanted to bring this topic up is, I think, it's something I've been thinking about, especially as I've worked with several organizations that work with younger kids. And again, we've mentioned it as part of other subjects in earlier podcasts. And I just kind of wanted to return to make sure we do this justice, because I think there's a lot of really great neurobiological stuff here. A lot of potential healing for kids that might have not got very many of these interactions growing up in chaotic or maybe even abusive homes. And so I just want to make sure that we revisit it and see what lessons can be learned. So, I know you two were bringing this up, so I don't feel like I'm the expert or maybe the best one to introduce it. So Curt, do you want to give it the first shot here about what is, when we talk about serve and return, what are we talking about? Why do you think it's important? And just to kind of introduce the topic to us and why it's important.
I think that there are a lot of levels at which serve and return is important, right? I mean, the title of this particular episode is Serve and Return Communication, and it is important in a sense of communication, in that there's a reciprocal nature to communication. But serve and return is a big concept that has to do with, one, how the brain develops, and how the brain really goes through the process of what structures get developed and what structures kind of go away, and also how the brain then develops in response to environmental input. It's kind of all of those things together, right? That something happens in the environment and a child responds, and what happens next then has a big impact on that child's brain development. And it has a big impact then on how that child learns how to deal with his or her environment. So that serve and return is a really fundamental nature that has impacts in the very minute sense or the momentary sense of behavioral development. It also has a lot of impact at a larger level of how our brain actually develops new structures, and what structures stay, what functions stay, and what kind of will get pruned away, so to speak. So it has a lot of applicability at a lot of different levels. And I tend to see it be kind of ubiquitous like that in a lot of the work that I get involved in, both with individual patients and with my staff. And I see a lot of that, the importance of serve and return that gets played out in multiple levels of organizations and individuals. And so it's a pretty big concept that can be applied in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
It's kind of a big explanation, and we can go into, we can dive into wherever you kind of want to jump into on there. And if communication is one of those it's really important for communication because it's got to kind of go both ways, right? There has to be some return on serve, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, using, you know, from what I understand of this, Jerry, you know, using sort of a racket sport. I may have mentioned I'm a big pickleball player, but also played some tennis, where I think this is kind of that the child sort of serves up something, and we want to be aware to respond to it, and then sort of go back and forth. But I know you can probably explain that a little bit better than I can.
I think that the metaphor of a racket sport was developed out of the Harvard Child Development Center, and really to give non-professionals an idea of a very complex process, right? And so it was nice to be able to think that not only in tennis are you serving and returning, but now the person on the other side of the court has to adapt to the way the ball comes back, the spin on the ball, the speed of the ball, the placement of the ball, and then returns it again. And now, so there's this constant interaction in which both players have goals, and that, you know, in tennis the goal is to win the point, right? And so both players are trying to, in some ways, respond to the other and reach their goal. And I think in the serve and return model, the goal really for the child is somehow to communicate to their caregiver that they're in a dysregulated state, or they're in a high arousal state when they're having a good time and they're happy, and that the caregiver has to be able to not only pick up the signal, but then to make meaning of that signal, and then respond in a timely and effective manner, right? And if that communication is accurate, there's feedback to that somehow you now have responded accurately. If it's inaccurate, the infant or child gives feedback to the adult again that somehow this didn't meet my need to get back to some regulated state, and the adult then responds. And so not only is the adult kind of responding to the child, but the child is actually organizing, responding back, and changing the behavior of the adult. And so it's a bi-directional interactional process in which, in some ways, is the beginning of one person communicating to another person what their internal state is, right? So I think it's a real important concept. And as Curt said, is as this interaction goes on, that there's pattern, rhythmic, repetitive activation of certain neural networks, either the stress response system or in some ways the reward system is getting. And so through these interactions, not only are states being communicated, but structures are being calibrated to be able to adapt to the relational world.
Mm-hmm. And so with this, the analogy of and I don't want to, the racket sport analogy is not why we're talking about the subject, but it almost seemed to me it's kind of like two tennis players trying to put on the best point possible. Like there's not necessarily a goal to win the point, but the goal is to kind of have the best back and forth volley that you can until it's time to sort of move on to something else. And I just kind of think of that from the parent perspective. And, you know, what sort of, and I'll kind of throw this out to either of you if you have an idea, but sort of what if people who are working with young children or actual parents are listening to our podcast, what are some meaningful things that we should look to that the child is serving us something, and then what do we want to try to return that serve? So when we talk about this, I'd love to kind of break it down at least to the initial part of that interaction, and what are we sort of looking for? What like triggers, hey, that the kid has served us something, and what are kind of some of the appropriate responses that we can do to maximize this neurodevelopment we're talking about?
I think one of the ways that we see this play out the most is with the escalation of symptoms, so to speak, that are indicative of a change in physiological state, that are very low level at first. And when they aren't effective, they are escalated to a higher level. And they essentially keep escalating until somebody responds. And so I'll give it kind of an example, right? You can see, we would see this, of course, I'll use a example from residential care. I mean, we see a child often would be fidgeting or moving around the room fairly rapidly and giving lots of cues that they were probably anxious. And that wouldn't be enough to engender a response from a caregiver. It wasn't quite high enough level to get their attention. And so that response would get escalated to, say, throwing something against a wall, or something that's a little louder, something that's a little bit more large in its form. And if that's enough to get a return on serve, so to speak, then that's what would be used the next time. Right, so it was a way of kind of symptom development that would be generated over and over and over again. And oftentimes we would see that pattern culminate with things like self-injury and aggression and property destruction, these very, very large behaviors that could have been headed off and changed their trajectory by recognizing earlier signs.
Fascinating. So I love that, because I wasn't thinking of it that kind of way. If we miss that initial serve, so to speak, there'll be again, that escalation. There's going to be a bigger serve coming sort of next time, that they're trying in some ways to get some attention, maybe even a kind of a call for help at some time, so to speak. Like I'm feeling dysregulated right now. So again, it might start out as fidgeting, and then if I don't get anybody kind of helping me, I'm going to escalate it to get that attention in another way.
I think a couple of things. One is, we're not just talking about children, right? Is that all of us, and especially all of our clients, come in and are communicating to us on multiple levels, right? They're communicating to us in terms of language, but they're also communicating non-verbally. They're also communicating in terms of what's happening here and now, but they're also bringing in their past expectations of what they believe is going to be happening right here and now, right? And so I think that it's important that when we take this concept and apply it across, whether it's a child, or a young adult or an adult that we're dealing with, is anytime there's not this kind of turn taking, there's an escalation, right? That's why sometimes when we're in arguments, we're not stopping and listening to each other and then responding to that. We're responding to our own internal state and not to the state of the other person, to kind of look at that, right? So all good communication is about listening, digesting, and communicating back. One is, do I really understand you? And two is, here's my thoughts now, and you become, right? When a child is younger, very little, this process. So that's one of the things I want to kind of bring up. But the other one is, I think in the interaction is sometimes what gets missed that escalates, especially in residential care or in a day treatment center or in a school, is that we respond to the behavior, but not to the internal state, right? And that in a way, when we're just responding to behavior, right? Behavior is the way in which the person is trying to cope with that internal state, right? And so, yes, we have to kind of respond to the behavior, but we also have to respond to what is the underlying need that's driving that behavior at this particular time. And so, in a way, how do we accurately communicate? And, you know, what Alan Shaw would say, this right brain, the right brain is your internal state and experience communicates with my right brain internal experiences, and then we put it into words, right? So I might say is, you know, you seem really angry by the way that you're getting aggressive right now, right? I'm telling you, I get not just your behavior to manage it, but I get your internal state. And we talked about that at the end of the last, about how to manage kids in residential. So sometimes their behavior is either so subtle we miss the signal, or so large we miss the internal state, right? So I think that as we kind of understand these concepts, it helps kind of organize us to realizing that we're responding to signals, right? Interpersonal signals. And the behavior, all behavior is a form of communication. And it's communicating in response to either a thought or an emotional state, or right, or not, and that we want to be able to kind of see it, make meaning of it, and then figure out how to respond in an accurate and reflective way, whether that be to provide some structure, whether that be provide some soothing, whether that be about, in some ways, increasing proximity or decreasing, whatever we're going to do, but it's about us reading those signals. So I think it's easiest to see and understand in the concept of an infant to a caregiver, but it happens throughout life. And especially for those kids who have difficulty putting their experience into language, right? Or adults, if they get highly aroused, whether it be excited about playing something and I can't calm down, or I'm dealing with something that's distressing, for most of us, we can somehow put some language and communicate to somebody else what's happening inside of us. But for lots of the clients we're going to use these techniques with, is that we need to be really, in some ways, creating meaning for them of what's going on, to kind of look at that. So I know that, Curt, you've done a lot of this when kind of talking about kids and, you know, young adults in terms of helping people look beyond the kind of behavioral disturbance, but really what's in some ways the function of this, and how do we respond to the function as opposed to just managing the behavior.
I was trying to formulate a question to go back on there have been so many conversations that, Jerry, you and I have had about this exact topic. And I was wondering if, from your perspective, you could share a little bit about kind of the conversation. I'll frame the conversations that we've had a lot. It's about, from a behavior analytic perspective, we talk a lot about functional behavior assessment. But in the behavior analytic world, we basically depend on 4 functions. And then when you put another layer on top of that, which is the neurobiology and the physiology and the understanding that we get from a trauma-informed lens, those 4 functions get expanded into a lot more than 4 functions. It's almost like there's kind of a primary and a secondary, and here's your first lens, and then you need to put this other lens on top of it. So that's just been one of those, we've had that conversation a lot of times.
So, you know, one of the conversations I can remember having is, you get a functional analysis and say you come up with the issue of attention seeking. Your behavior is attention seeking. So then we stop at attention seeking. And then I would say so that's really interesting. Why would this child seek this strategy to seek attention?
Why would it be a function?
What have they learned in their experiences that they're either not good enough to get attention, or they don't really, in some ways, even aren't aware of the impact of the behavior getting it, right? So how do we understand that, not just stop at the level of attention, right? And so if I go in and do, say, for example, planned ignoring, right? This child doesn't have any way to manage that state that gets when they have attention, right? And so really, it isn't so much that model, but it doesn't explain enough to help us in some ways use this serve and return concept.
It gets us to
do it. But it is a layer, right? It's a layer of trying to kind of understand something. And then when you get that, then you have to ask deeper questions.
Yeah, I found that the not having enough kind of lenses to view through often gets you not the optimal return on the serve that you're talking about, right? So if the serve is the behavior that we're talking about, and your intervention is the return on that serve, that's going to lead you in a different direction than you have been going in. That having multiple lenses helps you with getting better at identifying what that optimal return is.
Right. So we've talked about the polyvagal theory, right? And when you think about serve and return, in a way, the caregivers, and we'll use infants because the brain's developing, the nervous system's developing, is as that caregiver is responding to the internal state of the child, right? The caregiver is changing the biochemistry of the child, right? So the child gets stressed because there's something going on, either high arousal because excitement or some kind of state like hunger, thirst, cold, right? So the caregiver reads those signals, and the caregiver, if they're accurate in reading those signals and responds in a timely and effective manner, creates a dopamine rush for the child. It creates endogenous opiates, but it also creates oxytocin that happens. Oxytocin is a really important chemical in organizing and regulating and calibrating the parasympathetic nervous system, right? And so now when there's this accurate response, you begin to get higher vagal tone, higher kind of, right? So that this balance between sympathetic arousal and parasympathetic regulation becomes more effective. But if your experience is that there is someone either not returning your serve or returning your serve, but really not in any way close to what it is, so it's inaccurate or it's not timely, then what ends up happening is you're in some ways creating stress hormones and stress chemicals in your body as opposed to these. And so you not only does your brain not develop in the same way, your stress response system gets sensitized, but then your parasympathetic nervous system doesn't. So it's as Curt said, it's happening at multiple levels. So this easy concept of serve and return is such a complex interactional pattern, right? And we really began to know this when we were able to videotape and break down, second by second interaction and really begin to understand how many interactions occur in this little 1 second time between these two individuals, right? If this occurs between an infant and a caretaker who's very attuned within, like, say, seconds, imagine, say, in a therapeutic session, how many interactions are. Imagine in a residential milieu where there's 12 kids and there's 1-2 adults around, and you wonder why we miss cues or we're ineffective, right? I mean, it's so complex. And for me, is if you miss a cue for me, one is I could tolerate that state, and two is I can effectively find maybe a different way to communicate to you. But when you have individuals who, when their states get misattuned, it signals danger and threat. And they go from a calm state to a fear state within moments of seconds.
Mhm.
It's not out of the, it's almost expected that we will be managing crisis one after the other in those kind of milieus.
Yeah. And let me throw out,
Does that make
because
sense?
Jerry in one answer threw out parasympathetic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system, and polyvagal theory. So let me see if I can, just in case we have a new listener who's about ready to give up on us because has probably Googled polyvagal theory and wanted to shoot us all. Let me see if I can kind of bring this down just in case some of these terms are not familiar. So we've got the sympathetic nervous system, which is sort of that fight or flight, our fear-based kind of system. And then we have the parasympathetic is more relaxed, regulated. And one of the pieces of research, and guys feel free to jump in here if I'm misrepresenting the science at all, is the parasympathetic nervous or the calm part sort of puts a brake on our fear, fight, or flight response, because we always, if some danger pops in the environment, like a car swerves over in our lane, we want that sympathetic nervous system to react immediately and get us out of harm. So sort of, if I'm interpreting all this, is somebody, let's say there's a kid in a classroom that's getting frustrated with an assignment, for example, so there's that frustration, maybe doesn't have a good set of coping skills to work through that frustration. The teachers, because the teacher has 30 other kids in the room, might be over on the other side of the room. So this frustration's building. The sympathetic nervous system's becoming activated. Let me even try to throw the polyvagal in here. My heart rate, and I can't get into the spaces between the heart rate right now. If Curt thinks it's important, he'll add it. But my heart rate starts to rise. My biology is starting to get stressed out. And if the teacher sees me, that's sort of my serve that I'm getting stressed out. And the teacher sees me. And Jerry, what you're saying connects. I love the word attunement, but sees that I'm getting frustrated, connects with me around sort of my frustration. That oxytocin release that's there when eye contact's made, when the teacher gives a caring response, helps to bring that parasympathetic brake back on so the kid can maintain emotional regulation and then focus on the cognitive task in front of them. Did I get like a B- for that at least?
That's not bad.
Thanks, Curt.
Curt, take
and
this.
there's something between the heart rate,
Yeah,
and that's where we should focus on.
He just served you a lot. I served it to him, and now he's serving
Now
it
we're
to
serving
you.
it. We're playing.
I know, what a crappy return, Curt. Well, kinda, right? That's not what I need. But now my sympathetic nervous system's all triggered.
Well, you know, the sympathetic, as you talked about, I think it's great to connect around what kind of feelings happen when the sympathetic gets really activated, right? So you talked about fear and frustration being some of the affective states that are often associated with sympathetic activation. But also, I think it's also important to understand that sympathetic activation is what happens when we have any need. Right? It is our way of getting organized and taking action it's what mobilizes us. So it doesn't always have to be fear and frustration. And it can be a lot of things. And so we'll take it to an infant, right? An infant gets hungry and they get sympathetically activated, right? That activates them to start looking around for food. Right? And an infant doesn't have a whole lot of ability in the parasympathetic division of their autonomic nervous system to put a brake on the sympathetic nervous system. So as they get activated, because they're so in this developmental stage where they don't have a lot of ability to put a brake on, they keep escalating, right? The sympathetic keeps going, right? So children then fuss, right? They keep the response keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they really depend on a caregiver to function as the brake because it's not developed inside their skin yet. And it's not a developed area of their whole body. And so they've got to then go through these experiences of what we would call co-regulation, which is why attunement is so important. That is, then as you go back to what Jerry was saying, that then you get some certain biochemical changes that happen in relation to that experience, that they feel they get oxytocin and they get to experience the affective states that come along with oxytocin release, and that helps to develop their parasympathetic division to help them to self-regulate for the next time. And so each one of those tiny repetitions of experience helps that parasympathetic division to develop the ability to put a brake on the sympathetic nervous system so that they can then do self-regulation without having a co-regulator with them. And so each one of those little tiny repetitions is really critical for the next time they get activated. And that happens, now you think about the impact that an adverse childhood experience has on that process, just that one small little process. If those repetitions of oxytocin release and dopamine release and the reward circuit getting activated and the behavioral changes that happen, part of that's happening at the behavioral level, not just the biological level, is that the child can be learning how to interact effectively with a caregiver, or how to get needs met when they get their sympathetic activation happening. Like when hunger happens, how do I meet that need? There's something that the child learns behaviorally at that level that also is causing changes at the biological level. And when those repetitions get missed, or when they happen in a non-optimal way, that changes that teenager's ability to self-regulate, and it changes that adult's ability to self-regulate. All of those experiences early on are what creates our ability to regulate those internal states as we get older and go through different developmental stages.
Well, Curt, I think that was a wonderful answer.
Thank you, Matt.
So thank you for the return. Your serve was pretty crappy, in my opinion. My initial serve, but hey, I thought you did a great job, Curt.
You're so kind, Matt.
Jerry, so when we talk about trauma, and I think this helps because I think, if a lot of our listeners are like me, before the ACEs study and really looking at what a disorganized home environment can do to a kid, I don't think I appreciated the amount of impact that disorganization has on a child's development and neurodevelopment. And it also, I think, in Curt's answer, helps me also, it just reinforces the devastation of neglect as well. And I wonder if you can kind of speak to that from, I know you've done a ton of thinking and reading on child development, so that, if I'm serving something like I'm naturally programmed to do and nothing comes back, maybe for an extended period of time, or even fear or anger comes back, what's that doing to the young brain, and how does that kind of manifest a little later on in life too?
Good question.
Thank you, Jerry.
Nice serve.
I appreciate it. At least I get some nice returns.
Let me see if I can clearly articulate an answer to that.
Thank you, Jerry.
So when we think about how we're talking about, and Curt did a really nice job, but of talking about how this need state gets created in the infant, the parent serves as the co-regulator of that state and reads it and responds in an effective way and regulates the child, right? To kind of manage that. That sequence creates pattern, repetitive neural activity that is related to this concept of if it fires together, it wires together, right? And so as these pattern repetitive experiences of positive interactions occur, you have this brain that gets organized first in the lower, most primitive part, and then it moves to more complex levels. Then it moves to a relational, motivational, and then it moves to more cognitive kind of language and problem solving and all of that, right? So it moves, and the higher it goes, the higher the brain has the ability to inhibit lower brain activity, right? So we've kind of gone over that part. So that the brain then depends on stimulation both from the internal environment and from the external environment to create the conditions for it to be able to self-organize to higher, more complex levels, right? So we can have three different, and I'm going to break it down as simple as I can, and probably it's way more complex than this, but three different conditions. One would be a condition in where in utero, there's some insult that exposed to some toxicity, or there's some genetic defect that interferes with this process of brain development, right? The other one we've talked a great deal about is this issue of being highly stimulated to a point of overwhelming the nervous system and not having adequate support, abuse. When the nervous system is not exposed to the developmentally expected experiences it needed to organize, that's neglect. And so, in a way, under abuse, the brain adapts and reorganizes, but in neglect, there's not enough stimulation, so those structures don't even become organized. And so when we're dealing with individuals who have significant neglect, it isn't that we're trying to just regulate arousal states. We're actually having to go back and provide developmentally relevant experiences that are going to activate certain parts of the brain and the nervous system to be able to begin to organize. And that takes, the older the child is or the older the adult, hundreds of thousands of repetition in order to activate. So we have to, in some ways, go back and build in capacities that don't exist there. So there's the difference. And most of our traditional interventions have been focused on managing abuse impacts. And that's because kids who are abused or adults who are abused or veterans tend to create problems for other people, right? But when you look at the statistics in child welfare, neglect is way more prevalent. Mm-hmm. And neglect actually shuts down multiple regions in the brain because they haven't even been organized in order to be utilized yet. And so you may not have an overactive example, an overactive amygdala. You may have an amygdala that doesn't necessarily respond to kind of situations to kind of look at. So it's a very different, it's when there's nobody there to return your serve.
And so it's, you know, and I've been thinking about this a lot today with just some work and a project I'm working on about, you know, because I kind of, one of my questions that I was going to ask about this topic is, are we just talking about young children when we talk about serve and return? And I think the answer throughout our conversation is no. We all sort of need that reaction. And what I was thinking, I think about serve and return kind of from, there was a sort of a big action by the young child or the baby, and then there's a reaction from me. And I just, even though I don't have kids of my own, you know, it's kind of fun to play with them at a time. You know, you can hide the car behind your back and they smile or cry, then you bring the car back out and you do those interactions. But it also makes me think of just the reflections that we give people, the maybe just the little uh-huhs and the head nods and the eye contacts. As Jerry says, it could take, you know, and I'm thinking about, you know, adults experiencing homelessness or addiction that come from that, having an environment where either that return was very disorienting or it was non-existent, even though they may need thousands of repetitions there. If we're actively communicating, we can go back and forth pretty quickly, even if one person's just talking. Am I hearing you right, Jerry, with that? That's kind of part of the therapeutic process, whether you're a therapist or whether you're just active listening in whatever role that you're in.
So as I sit with clients, adults, children, I'm not only dealing with the serve and return process, right? But we all know is that when they're about to serve, they develop expectations of how I'm going to return that serve.
Yeah.
And then they begin to organize their behavior, not to who I am, but who they've developed expectations of who I am. So they're already going to assume you're not going to understand me. You're going to retaliate. Or if I told you this, you're going to leave me, right? And then they become defensive around their state, and then they have to. So they are dealing almost in a repetitive. They're not only the server, but they're the returner too in that interaction, right? And in a way, when we're in those, it's very important, and it's very hard sometimes to not. And as long as I'm doing this, I still have a hard time to kind of do it. Is when somebody is sharing their expectation, we want to kind of say is, oh no, you didn't hear my communication accurately, right? So you become the server too, instead of going, wow, it must be really hard to be in a world in which you expect people not to hear you, right? But it's hard to remember to say that you're just the returner at that point to do it. But right? And so when we're dealing, we're not in an equal relationship with our clients. So when they share their experience, and I had a mother who adopted a child, and the child kept telling the mother, I think you're going to throw me out all the time and you're going to leave me. And the mother would say is, I've been doing this stuff for 20 years, for 15 years with you, and you're still trying to, right? It's like, and then she turned to me and say, she never talks to me about anything, right? It's like she's trying to talk to you, but you're not listening, right? So in a way, it doesn't matter whether we're infants or children or adolescents. We want somebody to pick up our communication and not just respond back with their internal experience of the communication. So that is a really, it's a hard thing to do, to remember. And then the more kind of stimulation we're under, the harder it is to think that's what my job is, right? So multiply, I'm in a room with just one person and sometimes I forget to do this, right? And they experience me as misattuned. And then I got to go back and recorrect it and kind of look at it. But if I'm in a group, that's even a harder thing to do, right? And then if I'm in managing a large group, it's even a harder thing to do. And if you're on a podcast, it's even a harder thing to do.
There's no return.
Especially from Curt.
So I think is to remember that the process of a clinician is the same thing of, I'm reading your cues, I'm trying to make meaning of it, and I'm trying to respond in an accurate and reflect. And if I don't, and you get somehow aroused, I've got to then figure out is, how did I miss what you were trying to communicate? As opposed to saying, wait a second, I'm trying to do a good job and you're not responding to me.
Right.
And I think just realizing too that you are going to miss it. I mean, I think that's, in my, thinking about my training to be a therapist is sometimes, we're going to miss things, but then we get back on the same page. And that's incredibly therapeutic as well, because a lot of times folks they've hit a hard spot in a relationship and they go their separate ways, or they really go like this. So when you get out of attunement to get back there, to reconnect, to even apologize sometimes if you misread the situation.
Tronic calls it rule of thirds.
Absolutely.
So
I've also found as a husband, apologizing can be a really positive
rule of thirds is a third of the time you're accurately attuned, a third of the time you're misattuned, and a third of the time you're repairing.
Awesome. That sounds like my marriage. Yes.
I don't know. Maybe you're like
I think that's your perception.
Right.
Yeah, I know. Hopefully I hit those standards. Yeah.
Are you there, Sarah?
He doesn't have that middle one.
Yeah. Lots of, yes. So Curt, in all this, I got a question pops into my head for you from the behavioralist perspective. You know, when we talk about everybody get ready to drink, operant conditioning, and the creation. Most of when I think, and you've taught me a lot about behavioral management systems. I was never taught in school, but creating an environment that promotes positive behavioral change. Where does this? How serve and return as a reward? I'm trying to think like Curt, and I don't help me think about this as from that behavioral perspective. Why should people kind of care about this? Because I know you've thought a lot about this and integrated into a lot of your work with folks as well.
I was thinking when Jerry was given the example of how the misattunement process and the repairing process, right? That one of the drivers of that is, in that example, of course, was early learning history, right? Early attachment history. And one of the ways that happens from a strict behavioral way of looking at it is that attachment is one of the things that determines what types of returns will function as reinforcers. Right? That's one way of thinking about behavioralizing attachment, right? That it changes what will function as something that will increase our behavior or something that will decrease behavior. And so it changes what functions as reinforcers and punishers. What changes what will function as pleasant events versus unpleasant events. And when it's easy for those to get mismatched, right? Like Matt, you were raised in a different household in a different way than I was raised. So some things that are social interactions are unpleasant to you that aren't to me. Right? And you pull Jerry in there where you get a third one, right? And there's another history there where there are things that Jerry may say or do that would be very rewarding or very pleasant to his children that would not be to another child or a child in another family. So those are kind of attachment lenses are great ways of, I think it's one of those great areas where you can look at how we can then break those down into designing environments that work that way, that work in the direction that we want them to do.
So given that, Curt, talk a little bit about how culture goes into that.
Well, culture is a large collection of those individuals, right? So you just raise it up to another level where then now you have things that happen among large groups of people that become what we will call cultural norms. A woman who has written a lot about this in the behavior analytic literature is a woman named Sigrid Glenn. And one of the concepts she talks about is what she calls interlocking contingencies, where your behavior, Matt, impacts my behavior. And if your behavior impacts my behavior in a certain way, we're more successful. And when those things are interlocking with one another, now that's like what weaves a culture together. Have things that are mutually beneficial or that are mutually detrimental. We get organized around those things and our behavior really interlocks with each other and we become more collectively successful as a group in that way.
Fascinating.
So how would you think about that manifesting in clients coming into environments that are not culturally familiar to them, and the response in their nervous systems or their behavior or whatever would be activated in that thing?
Yeah, in that instance, our brain obviously has lots of structures and lots of functions that help us to detect unfamiliarity, and that activates our sympathetic nervous system. Right? That's what gets us activated to deal with something that's going to happen in the environment. And so that's in a real basic way, right? That's the amygdala. That's one of the structures that scans the environment for things that are unfamiliar and becomes activated when we see anything that's unfamiliar, good or bad. If there's something we haven't seen before, we orient to it. And so if those things are all repeatedly unpleasant, you've got somebody coming into an already unfamiliar environment where the cues are all different, and they aren't familiar and aren't interpreted in a way that normally we would. You have somebody who has an activated stress response all the time. And so now that gives you a bias towards interpreting unfamiliar things as threats, even if they aren't. As the stress response comes down, things that are unfamiliar aren't as likely to be interpreted as threats. As the stress response goes up, unfamiliar things are more likely to be interpreted as threats. And now we have that set of repetitions that get started in that direction. And without having the ability to turn it in another direction with the repetitions, we start to get whole collections of, then you get a culture on a residential unit, right? That gets developed by having people being in an unfamiliar environment, interpreting things as threatening, and then you get an interlocking contingency with the staff who have to be on that unit. And now we have a collection of people that are together, and they're not behaving in a way that is optimal for all of them as a group. So, and it's hard to change, right? There's a lot of complicated parts to that. But one of the fun things, of course, that I like to do is to break all of those things down and take them one at a time and go, let's change that one, and then let's change that one, and then we'll go to that one. And I found that it's possible to do.
So in some ways, people who have healthy relational histories of people who have provided serve and return experiences to do it would have a better regulated nervous system, would have better expectations of the world in terms of in seeing other people as resources, in terms of seeing myself with a positive growth mindset that if I do something, I can change that. They're going to see unfamiliarity as a possible opportunity, where another person coming into the same situation is going to see it as threat or potential danger or potentially threat.
Right.
So then they're reacting to kind of looking at that, right? And so we can have cultural differences that really can be incredible opportunities for us to begin to see with different lenses and understand different things and create different, or we could see differences as potential threats and become defensive and reactive to kind of looking at that piece, right? So it's a really, it makes it much harder to engage with someone when you see him as a threat, to engage in this serve and return, where I can't really hold your experience and hold my experience and have to do it, and we end up in some ways defending against each other.
Like constantly, right?
Right.
And that's
so what do we do? We can't leave them there. Like, I guess that's so you see.
A guy who loves social justice.
What do we do? We only got a couple minutes left of the podcast. We cannot leave our listeners on that note, Jerry.
Well, it's one of the things that I think I appreciated about working with Jerry over the years is you can ask a question like that's really big like that, right? Like, I remember asking a question like, so how do I become trauma informed, right? And the great answer to that question is you first ask the question.
Yeah.
Right. So even coming into designing an environment, if you're a new classroom, you're a new teacher starting a new classroom in the new year, at least coming into thinking about how am I going to run my classroom this year with the idea that I'm going to have children coming to my classroom who are going to have activated stress responses because everything's unfamiliar, and they may have a less of an ability to self-regulate, and they're going to need additional co-regulation because of their learning history. If you just did that much and let that kind of guide how you design a classroom, big implications to that, I think. But just by asking the question and coming.
I think that's correct. And I also think, Matt, that this goes back to, we have to start doing the work on ourselves. We have to realize that we are dealing with different cultures. And we have to be in a place to see their experience as an opportunity for us to learn something about them, as opposed to getting into a defensive state where I'm either trying to use power and control to change them or control them, or in some ways distance myself from them. So it's very easy to start out in saying, how do we create these programs to deal with these activated clients that come in here?
Mm-hmm.
When really, at some level, those clients are going to activate us. And if we don't start in some ways being able to create an environment where we could talk to each other and co-regulate each other and create safety and connection, then it's going to be very hard to accomplish the tasks and missions we have with the clients we serve. So that the parallel is the work, I think it's Becky Bailey talks about discipline always starts with self-discipline. So really is, how do we create safety for us, for individually ourselves, but also as a team, to be able to kind of recognize and give voice to each other, to hear each other, to do it, to be able to share responsibility, to be able to make collaborative decisions, to kind of feel like I bring all of those things that I think Sandra Bloom talks about in Sanctuary Models and others, really sets the groundwork for us to kind of be present, to hold the activated states of our clients when they come in and not react to those states.
Yeah,
That's a great point.
Absolutely. I think that's a better way to end the podcast. Take care of yourselves. And all you teachers out there.
Hey, Matt, show your shirt again.
Yes. Swag, people. I love the swag. So I want to thank you guys. I knew this was going to be a great discussion. I'm glad we got a little deeper in this issue than we have in previous podcasts. So again, you can always find more information, links, resources. If you listen to us, you can also find videos. My mom was in town a week or so ago. If you're listening, hi, Mom. She says, I really like your podcast with Jerry and Curt, but can you stop moving your hands as much? And I'm like, no.
Yes, I'm listening. Here I go, Mom.
Yeah, I was like, what are you talking about, Mom? So, yes, if you haven't seen my hand spasm or my sweet swag from Aurora Warms the Night, you can check that out on traumainformedlens.org as well. Next week, I'm really looking forward. I'm going to nerd us out a little bit and really think about, we have some technology that's trending in a direction that might be able to even address and eliminate traumatic memories. This is still maybe a decade away, but there's some really interesting technology coming out that I've been reading in some futuristic books. And so I'm gonna throw what's called a thought problem out to the group next week, which I think, even though it'll sound a little futuristic and weird, I think there's a lot of insights that we can gain for our work in the present as well. So I always try to put a little bit of practicality in to these fun things. So join us next week, and we'll go on that thought experiment together. And like I said, we always love your comments. If you have any ideas for our 1 year show too, you can go traumainformedlens.org, put some in the comments. We try to read and respond to all of those. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you next week.